pull up the Secretary of State site while I'm thinking about it.
Welcome, everybody, to our Louisiana 2 and 5 discussion. Tonight we have John Couvillon with us, a Louisiana politics expert, and we're going to be discussing the results of the congressional special elections in Louisiana's 2nd and 5th congressional districts. And we're also going to be taking a look at his predictions for the runoff in Louisiana's 2nd congressional district in April. So welcome.
Good to be here tonight.
Thank you. So I guess we'll just start off with just a general question. I guess we'll start with Louisiana. Well, I think we'll generalize it. What were some of the biggest things that impacted you the most in terms of things that stood out to you on election night last week?
So you had a couple things. I think the first thing is that despite the fact that Louisiana is a deep South state, the two congressional races did have echoes of what has been going on across the nation in terms of what demographic groups are supporting which candidate to what extent. The other thing which was surprising was one of the progressive candidates came very close to making the runoff in the 2nd congressional district. So those are really kind of the two, I guess, newsworthy things of these districts, which otherwise have zero impact in terms of who will be controlling the U.S. House of Representatives, other than the fact that the Republican victor can be seated much sooner than the Democratic winner, who we won't know until late April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. You brought up earlier just now something that was very interesting to me, because I know we talked a little bit about this before the election, but certainly a shock to everyone was definitely how well Gary Chambers did. I mean,
yes.
he did lose East Baton Rouge Parish, his home, but he did it pretty well elsewhere, specifically in Orleans Parish, finishing 2nd. Do you have anything to say about some of the areas of Orleans Parish that originally you might have predicted in terms of the precinct level under the wards to go to Karen Carter Peterson that actually ended up voting for Gary Chambers, or just in general, why did Gary Chambers overperform expectations?
So what I think is interesting, and this is the part that to me kind of echoes what's been going on nationally, is that a decade ago, one of the things that caught people's attention was that all of a sudden Republican primaries were no longer safe for incumbents because of the presence of the Tea Party, which meant that Republican incumbents had to start paying attention to that faction of the party or risk a primary challenge. Well, a decade later, I'm starting to see that happening on the Democratic side, where what's happening is just being an incumbent isn't enough. You do have an increasingly progressive and a progressive group of people that is more and more vocal about who they're willing to support or not support. That was perfectly evident when AOC unseated a longtime Democratic incumbent in New York a couple years ago, as well as when Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts unseated a long-time Democratic incumbent there. Echoes of that kind of sentiment were what happened in the 2nd congressional district, where even though this is a black majority district, the important thing to realize here is half of the vote was cast in Orleans Parish, and the white vote in Orleans Parish is not like the white vote in the rest of the Deep South. It's becoming a very liberal group of people who are basically down the line Democrats, unlike the rest of Louisiana. And Gary Chambers actually carried the white vote. And that to me is kind of interesting when you think that he's somebody who's from Baton Rouge, who didn't really have any claim to New Orleans beforehand, but he did spend the lion's share of his time courting the votes of New Orleans because it was half the district. So that to me is the biggest takeaway, is what happened in New Orleans, as well as the irony that Gary Chambers didn't do well in his own hometown of Baton Rouge, while as Karen Carter Peterson did not do well in her hometown or even her Senate district in New Orleans. She did better in Baton Rouge. So it was kind of interesting when you realized that you had two candidates who they weren't popular in their own backyards, but they both commanded a group of supporters that was noteworthy.
Mm-hmm. So you might be interested in this. Cynic 9, one of the mappers for RRH elections, which is a great site as well, mainly for the detail they put into their reporting on otherwise obscure races. But if you can see the map above, that's a map of Orleans Parish. So this is the breakdown of the precincts within each ward.
Okay.
And you can see it, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I just was wondering if you could explain to the viewers, since we're not experts on the different factions within New Orleans itself,
Right.
looking at the very sectional support, largely probably drawn on ethnic racial lines as well, if you could explain.
Yes. So first, let me divide the map in half. One of the things that's important to realize here is the Mississippi River basically divides the district in two, and that is evident, of course, by the little curved body of water you see. North of the Mississippi River is most generally Orleans Parish. South of the Mississippi River is generally the West Bank of Jefferson Parish, rather, with a portion of Orleans. Let me start with the upper right-hand corner. The way I interpret the map is this, and by the way, this is going back to what I was telling you about this progressive bloc of white voters that is willing to support more overtly progressive Democratic candidates and with very little affinity for the Republican candidates as well. In the upper right-hand corner, that's a lower income, primarily black area. It's the 9th Ward of New Orleans. And let's see, it looks like the blue is Troy Carter, who appropriately did well in the 9th Ward. And I would expect that, being that he's basically a mainstream center-left Democrat. Now, all of a sudden you see a sea of kind of a yellowish green right to the below that 9th Ward. That's a mixture of gentrified areas and long settled areas, and it's very white liberal, and so appropriately Gary Chambers did well there. Now, you see a line of blue that kind of divides it up in two as you're kind of traveling towards the southwest in Orleans Parish. Those are primarily black precincts near the interstate and near the Superdome. Then we cross over into the Garden District in the Uptown, some of which is in Steve Scalise's district, but a lot of it is in CD2. And as you see, Gary Chambers did well almost across the board, even though some of that is Karen Carter Peterson's state Senate district. And so, again, that's a very heavily white liberal area. And what I think is important here for those who think that Deep South politics means that all white voters will go Republican, when I did an analysis of the white precincts in Orleans as well as the rest of the district, the white vote in Orleans Parish voted 33% for Gary Chambers and only 14% for one of the Republican candidates. Meanwhile, once you got outside of Orleans Parish, the white vote went 69% to any one of those Republican candidates running and only 5% for Gary Chambers. So as you can see, there's basically a very strong yin and yang aspect to the white vote in this district, depending on what parish you're in. Now, having covered Orleans Parish, we're getting into Jefferson Parish, more specifically the West Bank, which is a primarily blue-collar area. And so if we were to start roughly in the middle of the screen off to the right, that is an area of New Orleans called Algiers. That is Troy Carter's state Senate district. And of course, he did very well there, unlike what State Senator Karen Carter Peterson did in her own state Senate district. The interesting
viewers, can you point out where Peterson's Senate district would be?
Certainly, that would be immediately to the right of the legend, where you see that little blue finger there.
Mm-hmm.
She has a couple of precincts in Jefferson Parish, which is that blue finger. It's a predominantly black area off of Airline Highway / Highway 61. And then the rest of her district is in Orleans Parish. It includes a lot of the precincts that Gary Chambers carried. And then some of her district, of course, is in CD1. So, of course, they would not have had the benefit of voting for her. So really the other interesting thing I wanted to point out, and this is zooming in again on the West Bank of Jefferson Parish, State Senator Troy Carter represents the Orleans Parish part that is in the West Bank, and then he has some Jefferson Parish precincts, which he all carried. Now you'll notice some splotches of red throughout the West Bank. Those are primarily white precincts. Where your mouse is right now is in an area called Gretna and Tarrytown. And if you were to take the pointer and move to the left, that would be moving into another suburb called Marrero. Again, it's primarily white, blue collar. If you keep going to the left along the river, the next suburb is West Wego. It's again a nearly all white blue collar area. The red you see there is for Claston Bernard. Even though there were 8 Republican candidates running, he did receive the most votes of any of the Republicans in the race. And so that's why you see those blocks of red in the West Bank of Jefferson Parish, unlike what you're seeing in Orleans Parish. The white voters in Jefferson Parish are much more conservative than those in Orleans.
Mm-hmm. And would you generally say that's a dichotomy between the white voters in the general vicinity of New Orleans? You saw definitely Chambers and in some precincts Carter Peterson doing well with the more urban progressive white voters, whereas the white voters living in the suburbs were more partial to a Republican like Claston Bernard?
I would say yes. Now, one of the things that occasionally is kind of a nuance to the rule is when you're talking about the suburbs in Jefferson Parish, which are in the 1st Congressional District, that's all the area that's grayed out at the top of the map. They tend to vote Republican, but they do not have a very strong affinity for either Donald Trump or for the 2019 nominee, a gentleman named Eddie Risponi. So I would say they're more independent in their Republican voting. Whereas the people who live in the West Bank, it's pretty much racial voting in terms of whether they vote Democratic or Republican. So that kind of explains the alternating checkerboard you see of areas that Gary Chambers carried in Orleans Parish, as well as areas Claston Bernard carried in Jefferson. And then, of course, Troy Carter, who did technically carry Orleans Parish, although at the plurality, but he ran away with the race in Jefferson Parish. So it's really interesting factional politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess we'll move west through the district now just to get a little bit more.
And you'll notice, too, as you're moving out, a brief aside, if you go back to the right side of the map, that easternmost part of Orleans Parish, that is an all-white area. It's sparsely populated, does have some Vietnamese settlements out there, but Claston Bernard carried it because, of course, it is a nearly all-white area. It's primarily conservative, but, of course, it doesn't nearly have the votes to offset any other Democratic-heavy areas of New Orleans. But it is something I wanted to point out in terms of why that red area sticks out.
Mm-hmm. And
so
I
anyway,
thought, real quick as well, it would be interesting to look at second place finishers by precinct here. So it's a bit more scattered. I mean, I wouldn't say the breakdown between the progressive white communities and the traditional black communities is quite as distinct with this, but generally you can still see that Karen Carter Peterson should probably be doing a lot better up here.
Yes, and that was to me something which shows some work she has to do, is the fact that she didn't really dominate anywhere. I mean, she did better in Baton Rouge than she did in New Orleans,
which is ironic because Chambers is from there.
Right, and I think that speaks to, let's just be polite and say, the reception they get from their constituencies in either Baton Rouge or New Orleans. That was plainly borne out by how the election results went in both East Baton Rouge and Orleans parishes, was the fact that Karen Carter Peterson did relatively well in Baton Rouge, not so much in Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, she ran third in Orleans Parish, which really is kind of embarrassing if you think about it.
Yeah. Yes, but moving west, I guess we'll move over to St. Charles Parish, which is the most Republican parish in the district, and Claston Bernard ended up doing fairly well here.
Correct. And what
other Republicans on the ballot?
And what you see with regards to the blue precincts, not only on the east bank of Jefferson Parish around the airport, that's a primarily black area. Then in St. Charles Parish, which is immediately to the west, those are the black precincts where you see Troy Carter did well. And one of the things you have to remember, yes, St. Charles Parish is, relatively speaking, Republican. The district was drawn to include as many black precincts as possible between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And so that's why you see the shape you do, is it was intricately getting all these black neighborhoods, like in St. Charles Parish and at every other parish up the river. So what you see as you move further to the west, now we're getting to St. John Parish. It's a 60% black parish. And the big blue stripe you see near the river, that again is black majority neighborhoods. And Claston Bernard on the neighborhoods further away from the river, he carried those. As you're continuing to move, now you're into St. James Parish. This is the heart of petrochemical country, 50% black. Again, the black neighborhoods preferred Troy Carter by and large, whereas the white neighborhoods in St. James Parish, once you get further away from the river, they supported Claston Bernard. Then as you move further up the river, now we're getting into Ascension Parish. Even though Ascension is a suburban, mostly Republican parish, the Democratic parts of the parish close to the Mississippi River are what are included in the district. And so that's why you see this kind of amalgamation of areas that Peterson did well in, as well as Troy Carter with some Claston Bernard precincts thrown in.
Mm-hmm.
The next parish you see after Ascension is Iberville Parish. It's a 50% black parish, but one of the things that'll immediately jump out at you is you'll see kind of in the center of the screen this kind of red square. That's basically some areas that have seen suburbanization from Baton Rouge, and so, of course, Claston Bernard did well there as well. Right next to the legend, now we're getting into not just Iberville, but West Baton Rouge Parish. You're seeing suburban neighborhoods that, because they geographically are between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, had to be included. And otherwise, it's black neighborhoods that are included. And the last piece of the puzzle, that's Baton Rouge there, or at least the black precincts in Baton Rouge. And as you can see, there's kind of a alternation between the precincts that Peterson carried versus the ones that Gary Chambers carried.
And do you have any explanation for why Gary Chambers, frankly, underperformed expectations in the one part of the district where he arguably was thought to have somewhat of a chance?
Well, I think what is important to appreciate here is he is very, I shall say, passionate in his beliefs, and that passion has led him to get arrested and participating in demonstrations and things like that. And I think that style turns off more black voters than it attracts. And Karen Carter Peterson had advertised fairly heavily in the Baton Rouge media market. And so that didn't help her very much, unfortunately, because East Baton Rouge Parish undervoted relative to the rest of the district and came in at about 10% of the total vote. But nevertheless, if you look at from a geographical standpoint, that's why you see her carrying so many precincts in Baton Rouge. Is I just think that she advertised more than Troy Carter did, and therefore she had more strength, and she was seen as the alternative to Gary Chambers in those Baton Rouge precincts.
And is there any racial difference here? Is there a higher percentage of black voters in the precinct that broke for Chambers versus Carter Peterson, or no?
I would say that every one of those precincts in East Baton Rouge Parish is 70+% black. In other words, you don't have any white neighborhoods. Those precincts were carefully selected because they were overwhelmingly black even 10 years ago. In fact, what you'll find interesting, you'll see a little white notch in the middle of the screen right by the letters Baton Rouge.
Yep.
That one area which kind of sticks out, that is downtown Baton Rouge, which is majority white, heavily liberal. It was excluded from the district just because it is a white majority precinct. And so I think the thought was they wanted to get the black voting population as high as they could with regards to constructing a black majority district. Whereas everything else you're highlighting in East Baton Rouge Parish, those are overwhelmingly black precincts. I could hardly think of any in that list who are less than 90% black.
Now, this might just be an assumption on my part, but given the margins in both of these districts, I would assume racially polarized white neighborhoods in these three precincts possibly do very well.
Yes, and what you're referring to there is, so we've crossed the river into West Baton Rouge Parish, which is mostly a small town parish, but it has seen some suburbanization. That red you see there,
very heavily Republican.
Yeah, it is a town called Port Allen, which directly is right underneath the levee along the Mississippi River. The white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods are divided by Louisiana State Highway 1, which is why you see that stark difference between the red and the precincts that Chambers had carried. And a little aside there, what I think accounts for why Gary Chambers did so well in West Baton Rouge Parish, there's a state representative there, a black state representative. His name is Edmund Jordan. Gary Chambers had supported his campaign when he got elected back in 2016. And so I'm sure that there was probably some returning of the support and helping Gary Chambers get a good black vote in West Baton Rouge Parish, as
Mhm.
opposed to the weakness you saw for Gary Chambers on the East Baton Rouge Parish side of the river.
Mhm.
The red at the bottom of the screen, those are suburbanizing Republican neighborhoods,
Mhm.
but they had to be included because you, of course, have to have a contiguous district.
Yes. Yeah. That's very true. And I guess a lot of viewers just now will make the exception there that the first district, Scalise's district, is still contiguous because of the bridge over Lake Pontchartrain.
Correct. A water body.
Yes, that counts.
And you can argue the Gulf of Mexico too, because Steve Scalise's district skirts around the side of New Orleans into St. Bernard and Plaquemines and Lafourche and Terrebonne. And I think the idea is it's a body of water that allows those to be quote unquote connected. In other words, that gray precinct you see roughly off to the right of the screen there, that's the connecting piece that is in Steve Scalise's district.
Mhm.
That enables the district to sweep around from St. Tammany down into St. Bernard and Plaquemine and the southernmost part of Jefferson Parish and so forth.
Mhm. Well, I think now we'll move on to the fifth district. There's not as much
Okay,
to look at there, but there are some important things to discuss as well from the precinct results we saw there. So we'll take a look at that.
certainly. So
So,
what's worth explaining about the fifth district, unlike the second district where you kind of have some interesting factional politics going on and the white vote is heavily liberal in New Orleans, not so much in the rest of the district. The fifth district is a primarily small town district with Monroe and Alexandria being the only cities of any size, and even those are about 50,000 apiece. You do have a little bit of suburbanization in parts of the district, and that's roughly off to the right. But more importantly, this is a small town, deep south, heavily evangelical district that is basically as racially polarized as you might see in Mississippi next door. And you do have a 33% black voter registration, which of course is why President Trump carried the district 64 to 34%. And that 34%, in other words, is the black vote.
mhm.
So the heavy sea of red you see, basically, the black population in this district is pretty much concentrated either along the waterways such as the Red River or the Mississippi River, or in the inner cities. So kind of in the center, the upper part of the center of the screen, we see that splotch of blue there. That's inner city Monroe.
Mhm.
And of course it's heavily black. And immediately above it is another town, Bastrop, which is home to a closed paper mill. Again, it's heavily black. And all these other areas you see where there's blue, those are heavily black precincts along some waterways. That is where the one Democrat in the race, a lady named Candy Kristoff, got her vote. And actually, what's interesting is Julia Letlow, who was the victor in that race, who took the place of her late husband, who never had a chance to serve after he got elected. Julia Letlow basically received 83% of the white vote and 12% of the black vote. So what you're seeing there in terms of the bright red hue of the district is the vast majority of those rural precincts are nearly all white. And Julia Letlow did very, very well there. I mean, she did very well across the entire district with one small exception. The one place where Candy Kristoff, the lone Democrat, did well was in black neighborhoods such as Monroe, which is where your mouse is pointing right now. And if you were to go immediately to the left, you would see another splotch of blue. That is Ruston and Grambling, which is Ruston is home of Louisiana Tech, and Grambling is Grambling University, and Grambling University is a black college. That's a big black population there. The other big black concentration from a numbers standpoint is down in Alexandria, where when you see a swath of blue along, it looks like a line, that's the Red River. And so the black neighborhoods in that parish, which is Rapides Parish, of course, in Louisiana, we have parishes and not counties like the rest of the nation. The black neighborhoods are all along the Red River and are kind of centered on downtown Alexandria. And so that's the one part of Alexandria / Rapides Parish, which is Democratic, is the center part of Alexandria, as well as some precincts along the Red River. Beyond that, the only Democratic concentrations, let's scroll south some. You see a big splotch of blue, go further south, right there. To your right some. So what we're talking about here, St. Landry Parish is 50% black, and the black neighborhoods are concentrated pretty much in the city of Opelousas, and that blue splotch you see to the right, it's a black area, but it's a rural precinct, so not many people there. But Opelousas is a majority black town, and it outvotes all of the heavily Republican rural areas around it.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting, even though I had told you this is a Protestant and evangelical district, you do have two exceptions to the rule, and that is St. Landry and Avoyelles Parish, which is, of course, where your mouse is pointing now. Those are primarily Cajun parishes, meaning they're nearly all Catholic. In the old days, the Cajun parishes used to be much more Democratic, but now they vote nearly as heavily Republican as the North Louisiana parishes do. So that is the majority of the district. The only other part of the district is off to the right. It is a rural area known as the Florida parishes, which has seen some suburbanization. And basically, the blue areas you see are the black neighborhoods across the Florida parishes, with some suburbanization from Baton Rouge here and there. And I would like to comment about the one splotch of orange you see in the center of the screen.
His hometown, right?
Yes. Yeah, so there was you had a multitude of Republican candidates running. One of them, his name was Chad Connerly. He lives in that area, which is the one orange square you see, and that's the town of Kentwood, which also is where Britney Spears is from.
Yeah.
Little trivia for you there. And then that's Amite, which you just pointed your mouse on. And I would assume that basically that part of the parish, which we're talking about Tangipahoa Parish now, the suburban parts are generally in Steve Scalise's district to the south, but there are a few suburban precincts. The general tone of Tangipahoa Parish, however, is small town and rural. And so you'll see
That's
the black.
where Governor Edwards is from, right?
Correct. Governor Edwards is from a town called Roseland.
Okay.
And so the blue you see basically along Highway 51 and the Tangipahoa River, those are black majority precincts that are in the district. And everything else is rural and generally rural and small town, with a couple of exceptions of the southernmost precincts, which have some suburbanization. But Julia Letlow, other than not doing well in Chad Connerly's hometown, pretty much swept that and everything else in the Florida parishes.
And another question that we had, and this was largely from viewers on election night, and
yes.
We do admit that obviously it's a low turnout special election in an uncompetitive district, so not really indicative necessarily of future trends, but I know the big things that were pointed out were the pretty much the Letlow's strong performance for being a Republican in Madison Parish and in East Carroll Parish, which are obviously both have strong black populations, and they're both areas in which you would not expect a Republican candidate to do very well. So can you explain a little bit about the dynamics, maybe the racial turnout dynamics? Was black turnout lower than usual in the 5th?
Yes, and also, too, I'd like to add that when we're talking about the racial breakdown of these parishes, immediately to the south of Madison Parish is another black majority parish, Tensaw.
Mm-hmm.
So typically in most normal turnout elections, those three parishes along the Mississippi River always vote Democratic because, of course, they have black majorities.
Mm-hmm.
What happened on Saturday night was the black turnout tends to lag in those parishes, meaning that even though it may be 55 or 60% black by voter registration, it probably turned in about a 45 to 50% black performance in terms of the percent of the whole. You also have extreme polarization, number two, and meaning that Julia Letlow most likely got in the 90+% of the white vote because she's from next door Richland Parish, which is that splotch of there you go, Richland Parish, which is where Luke Letlow is from.
Mm-hmm.
That is a white majority parish, but because in a small town area like that, there is kind of some territorialism. In other words, well, he or she's from our part of the district. I think that you had some hometown affinity because I was seeing white majority precincts in those Delta parishes where Julia Letlow got 90+% of the white vote. When you combine that with a reduced black turnout, number one, And number two, I did see precincts where Julia Letlow was getting between 50 and 20% of the black vote. Combine all three of those items together, and that is why Julia Letlow carried those normally Democratic parishes.
And in terms of winning 12% of the black vote in this race, despite the turnout being lower for black voters, how similar would that be to a normal performance for somebody like Ralph Abraham in this district in a normal general election turnout year?
Right. So when Ralph Abraham was first running for Congress, he did not get anywhere near 12% of the black vote because he was running against a black Democratic mayor of Monroe. And because most of that part of the state is in the Monroe media market, anything the Monroe mayor does, you have instant name recognition all around those rural parishes. So in other words, the black voters knew that there was who the black candidate was. And so you had extremely polarized racial voting. Now, with regards to Ralph Abraham's reelection, he, of course, did better with the black vote as he was running for reelection in 2016 and 18 because he was really good at providing constituency services. He was available to district residents. And in a small town district like this, it's important for voters to personally know their congressman. In other words, if all you do is show up on TV and never visit the district, that is viewed as a distinct negative. You have to work the district hard because it's a poor district. It interacts with the federal government in a lot of ways, but if you pay attention to those voters, that's how you do well with white and black voters.
So basically, if the people feel like you've forgotten them, you're going to be on hot water. Basically, you're going to be out of there.
Correct. And a perfect example of that, when former Governor Bobby Jindal first ran for governor in 2003, he actually lost many of those rural parishes in Northeast Louisiana. And in the next 4 years, he spent every Sunday going up to churches in that part of the district to make himself known. And he turned around his poor showing by carrying those same parishes in 2007. So that just goes back to the value of personal contact in these smaller parishes where voters there still have a antiquated idea of, knowing who their elected officials are.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we can move on to discussing the runoff briefly in Louisiana too. And then if you have any extra time, we can just answer some Louisiana politics questions that some viewers have or things that I know they would be interested in hearing about.
Okay.
So I guess just take the floor. What are your predictions for the runoff? And just tell us anything that you're open to telling us about the runoff in April.
So what I think is important when we're talking about the runoff, on the surface, it looks like you have two black Democrats who are running, and the Democrats are a guaranteed hold for this seat. But of the two contenders, Troy Carter is what I would consider as more kind of in the mainstream of the Democratic center left, and he's offended few people, and he has the endorsement of the outgoing Congressman Cedric Richmond, as well as numerous public officials up and down the district. His opponent is a lady named Karen Carter Peterson. She's in the progressive left, and her endorsements are from Stacey Abrams and Katie Porter, neither of whom, of course, are from Louisiana. And so that right there kind of illustrates the stylistic differences between the two candidates. Now, in terms of how the race will go, you have two blocks of voters who are basically going to play kingmaker here. You have the 21% who voted for Gary Chambers. I would think of those as very progressive voters who more likely than not are automatically going to go to Karen Carter Peterson, but I don't think it's going to be an 100% shift over into her corner.
Mm-hmm.
Karen Carter Peterson absolutely needs that vote to stay afloat in the runoff because, of course, she finished second with 23% of the vote. So she desperately needs that 21% that went to Gary Chambers to have a chance. The other part of the vote, which will be the kingmaker, and this to me is actually kingmaker with a capital K, capital M. You had 16% of the vote that went to one of the Republican candidates running. Neither candidate, neither Peterson nor Carter, can get to 50% without getting an appreciable number of those Republican votes. So in other words, they're the ones who, to me, are going to decide the election. I would think, logically speaking, they would be more comfortable with Troy Carter because he is less far left progressive, number one, and as well as the fact, and the fact that Karen Carter Peterson was the chairwoman of the Democratic Party in Louisiana. But she did support charter schools, so it'll be interesting to see how both of the candidates try to appeal to the Republican vote. But I would say that more so than Gary Chambers' vote, that Republican vote is the kingmaker here.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the runoff, do you have a prediction for how close it's going to be on election night? I mean, we know it's going to be a contested race. It's going to be competitive. But if you had to make a prediction, and if you've seen potentially any polling thus far, what would you say in terms of a matchup, how close it's going to end up being?
At this stage in the game, I would say Troy Carter has the lead. But everything is speculative because, number one, all that's been going on this first week of the runoff has been just basically more endorsements that Troy Carter's been racking up. But you haven't seen the candidates on TV, nor have there been any debates or any things like that. So this, to me, is the period where candidates are raising money. With regards to having a firm feel as to how the race goes, you almost have to see how the early vote is going to go in a couple of weeks when it gets started again, because I'm of the opinion that it's going to be similarly low turnout like what you had in the primary. The question is how much lower will it go? Because this was an 18% turnout race. I see it as like a 15 to 18% runoff turnout, particularly since some of the races which were on the ballot at the same time as the congressional race have been settled. So you don't have that reason for voters to go to the polls now. You'll literally, in most of the district, just have a congressional race to vote on.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any other comments or things worth discussing about the runoff before we move on to just a couple minutes talking about Louisiana political questions?
Just I think that'll be interesting to see how the Gary Chambers vote will go. He's not endorsed any candidate yet, and it's interesting to see what he'll do, or his supporters do for that matter. And the Republican who got the most votes, a gentleman named Claston Bernard, he refuses to endorse as well, although his reason is none of the candidates are Republican enough for his taste. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where the winds blow with regards to the Chambers vote versus the Republican vote, because that is going to be what determines the runoff, particularly the Republican vote.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I just have a couple questions, and I know people are interested in hearing about your responses, but this is also about the 5th District, and I think it's interesting to discuss since you've described the 5th District repeatedly as a heavily religious district and a district in which the constituents are keen on knowing their congressman and knowing their congressman is there, knowing that he represents their values, or at least is there in terms of providing constituent service. So my question for you has to do with the last special election prior to this one in the 5th, where Vance McAllister won.
Yes.
And obviously he got in hot water for being inappropriate with a female staffer, which was kind of like adultery, even if it wasn't a full affair. And basically my question for you is, how did that inflame essentially the moral sensibilities of the voters, and how did that disconnect him from the voters? Because he finished in a distant, I believe, 4th or 5th place as an incumbent.
Right. Well, I think the problem was when Vance McAllister was elected in 2013, the dynamic you had there, it was an all-Republican runoff. And so one of the things that's not appreciated unless you look at elections in Louisiana and to some extent California and Washington is if you have both candidates from the same party in a runoff, basically the minority party is what decides the election. And so in this case, because the other Republican running against Vance McAllister was pretty far to the right and connected with the Jindal administration, and he gave the appearance of being overconfident, Vance McAllister got all of the Democratic vote and just enough of the Republican vote to win. So it was kind of an interesting coalition you had of two groups who were pretty disparate. The moment that the infidelity came out, that basically cost Vance McAllister heavily amongst the conservatives, because he hadn't done anything to woo them once he got into office, which in my opinion was a big mistake. And so he didn't, and then of course, because he was a Republican and you had a black Democrat running against him, that took away that 30% of the vote. So he was the proverbial man without a country when it came to his reelection campaign in 2014.
And did it hurt him at all in terms of a perception of him being indecisive when he announced he wasn't running and then he announced that he was getting back in the race?
I'm sure that didn't help, but it was kind of a case of he was basically a dead man walking from the get-go, and he never really righted the ship, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that definitely reinforces what you said earlier about the fifth and how congressmen, or in this case, congresswomen, should definitely remain not just faithful and uphold moral values that the constituents regard highly, but also just to stay connected with the constituents regardless of their race or political affiliation.
Yes. And I think another thing that's important to appreciate too, when you're talking about rural districts like this, that either A, have a lot of poor people, or B, are heavily agricultural, that means that you have a lot of interactions with the federal government, which in plain English means that these districts are heavily dependent on the pork barrel. So you cannot run as an economic conservative in this district. You have to play up the religious angle much more.
Mm-hmm.
And in Dr. Abraham's case, because he was a medical doctor who had treated virtually everybody in that region, because not only was he a medical doctor, he was a vet before that. So he basically had a natural constituency already. But
Mm-hmm.
if you were to run as a conventional economic conservative, it doesn't get you as much traction in this district that is fairly dependent on the federal government for various things.
And just a brief aside, as you said earlier, I think it's interesting to look at the number of physicians or people of a medical background who have entered Republican politics in the state of Louisiana. I mean, you mentioned Abraham,
Yes.
Bill Cassidy as well. I think Charles Bustani, who never made it to the runoff in the 2016 Senate race, unless I believe he was also a physician.
He was, and you also had former Congressman John Fleming, who,
Yeah.
when he similarly did not make the runoff, just like Bustani did not in 2016, Fleming took a job with the Trump administration. But yes, they were all doctors, and of course, Bill Cassidy, a doctor as well. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's a kind of an interesting representation that you have. It certainly helps with regards to fundraising if you're a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
because it gives you access to a fundraising constituency that you would not normally have access to as a normal candidate.
Yeah, and even the crafting of healthcare policy. I was reading today in the most recent almanac, kind of in preparation for this, I was reading up on Bill Cassidy, and it just reminded me back in 2018 when the big discussion was about the ACA repeal and how Cassidy initially was the one who argued that Republicans should include protections for pre-existing conditions in their American Health Care Act proposal to replace the ACA. And he kind of got a lot of attention and got himself included in the policymaking after that.
Yes, and that's certainly something he kind of developed a niche interest in, because he was also a doctor at the Charity Hospital in Baton Rouge back before he got elected to Congress. So he has a wealth of experience with regards to healthcare and the government interactions with healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, and we have a question from one of our live viewers now.
Okay.
About the runoff, and he says, will it make a difference that Troy Carter picked up the endorsement of the Baton Rouge mayor, the Metro Council president, and state rep Tim James?
I believe it would help, and actually it was Ted James, but the way I look at it is this. When you think of the optics of 3 endorsements from the Baton Rouge area coming for Troy Carter in rapid succession, and by the way, that was one of Troy Carter's weaker parishes. I don't think he carried a single precinct in East Baton Rouge. Fortunately for him, East Baton Rouge Parish punched below its weight and only cast about 9% of the district vote. But having that edge in terms of the mayor, who's very popular with Black constituents, a state representative who's very popular, and the number 2 man in city parish government also being popular, it certainly doesn't hurt in terms of the message it sends out to the Black constituency in East Baton Rouge Parish. And by the way, it's not just East Baton Rouge Parish that gets Baton Rouge TV, but all the neighboring parishes around it, such as West Baton Rouge and Iberville and Ascension. So that kind of messaging to me goes beyond the parish borders because, of course, of the periphery, where the periphery of the Baton Rouge media market is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess I have 2 more questions, I think, that were formatted before this. The first one deals with something we talked about over the phone before the election, and that is the possibility that another, or I guess you could say, the 5th district could be redrawn to be a second majority Black district in redistricting, and thus a second Democratic district. What do you think the odds of this are in terms of the relationship between John Bel Edwards, who has veto power, and the Republican legislature, which has pretty much spurned all of his desires since he took office? I mean, notably first by rejecting his nominee for Speaker of the State House.
I say it's going to be a very complex puzzle for a couple reasons. Number one, you're talking about the optics of possibly unseating a female Republican who just got elected to Congress. And Julia Letlow is the first female Republican elected to Congress from Louisiana. So the thought of her being victimized by redistricting, I think, wouldn't look good. The second thing is, even though you're likely to see a partisan battle for redistricting, you do have a question as to where Governor Edwards would draw the line in the sand as to what would cause him to veto versus sign a redistricting plan. And we don't know necessarily what the Black Caucus would do because they represent the lion's share of the Democratic legislators, both in the House and the Senate in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And the third and final piece of the puzzle here, as if that weren't complicated enough, is that if you would have a gubernatorial veto, there is the possibility of this going to court and the court redrawing the lines. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a very complex puzzle right now. I mean, to me, the most important thing is seeing what the population looks like per parish, which at the present time looks like it'll be in August that we'll get that data.
Yeah, I think that's this fall is when we're going to start seeing early drafts and conceptions for maps across the country.
Right. Because basically what I can tell you right now from looking at the 2019 population estimates is that the two North Louisiana districts would have to expand in size, which would mean going southward.
Mm-hmm.
The New Orleans district, ironically, will probably be overpopulated because it's still seeing some rebound from all the post-Hurricane Katrina losses from 2005 to around 2010. And then, of course, you have suburbanization between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, which means the 1st and the 6th congressional districts will be overpopulated. So really, I see the 1st, 2nd, and 6th districts shrinking some in size, the 4th and 5th moving kind of southward, and the 3rd district could probably stay where it's at.
Mm-hmm. Do you think theoretically Letlow that she could run in the 4th district and challenge Mike Johnson if her district were theoretically drawn to become a Democratic district?
Well, in the scenario you described, what it sounds like would happen is that right now the two North Louisiana districts are divided vertically, which roughly would be at the periphery of the Shreveport versus the Monroe media markets. In the scenario you describe, I think what we'll be talking about would be the horizontal slice where the 4th district would basically go horizontally along I-20 between Shreveport and Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have a Black district that would probably pick up Black neighborhoods in Monroe and Baton Rouge and other places. So it would be a different orientation as to how those North Louisiana districts look if it were under the scenario you described.
Mm-hmm. And I guess now that we've wrapped up that topic, unless you have any last things to add, my last question would be in terms of Democratic viability and potential future races. I mean, Obviously, when John Bel Edwards first took the governorship in 2015, he was basically a Democrat that perfectly fit what a traditional Louisiana Democrat would be, someone who is economically liberal, supports unions, supports Medicaid expansion, but is against abortion, has pretty strong Catholic moral values in terms of that. And obviously he was running against a scandalous opponent in David Vitter, and he repeatedly hounded him for his prostitution scandal. And after losing that, he pretty much just retired from the Senate and quit politics in 2016. But he won re-election narrowly against Eddie Rispone in 2019. And this is a two-part question I have for you. Number one, had Ralph Abraham made the runoff, could that race have gone differently? And number two, once Edwards is done serving as governor, do you have any opinions on who the best Democratic potential candidate could be to maintain the governor's mansion for the Democrats?
Okay, so I will start off with Ralph Abraham. Now, the interesting thing about that race was that Ralph Abraham was much more of a grassroots kind of guy who was beloved by the party faithful. Eddie Rispone, he was basically a media candidate who had basically $15 million that he dumped on TV. And to tell the truth, the ads were not very good, but there were enough of those ads on TV to where that's how he got past Ralph Abraham. But the tremendous cost that those ads came at was that Rispone started getting nervous near the end of the primary cycle, and he started attacking Abraham. and some of the attacks landed below the belt. And so Abraham did the bare minimum he could to endorse Risponi because the two clearly had, issues with each other. If let's pretend Ralph Abraham had made the runoff, even though I think he would have projected well on TV, he did have a problem with regards to his absenteeism record in Congress, which John Bel Edwards was aggressively making an issue of. And I think that he would have gone full throttle on that issue in a runoff scenario. So even though I think Ralph Abraham would have been the more visually appealing candidate, I think that the attendance record would have been something that he would have needed to have addressed fast. Now, with regards to the second part of your question about the Democrats, one of the things you have to remember when John Bel Edwards got elected in 2015 was the Democrats lost their last senator, which of course was Mary Landrieu the year before. And the thought was the Democrats could never win again because they were steadily losing power from about 2005 to 2014. What that means in plain terms is as the Democratic office holder base was steadily shrinking down to almost nothing, that meant that the Democrats were desperate to find somebody to try to run. And because no one else stepped up, John Bel Edwards kind of took advantage of the void, and he used the pro-life and pro-gun attitudes as a way of at least getting a second look from normally Republican voters. And then, of course, he was aided by David Vitter's problems. But what I'm describing, very long response here, was John Bel Edwards fell into a unique set of circumstances, which was Democrats were dispirited after losing a U.S. Senate seat, and you had Republican infighting that was so savage in 2015 that John Bel Edwards was left unscathed because all the Republicans wanted to face him in the runoff, so they left him alone, which meant John Bel had all this time to build up his political bona fides and make it look like he was quasi-Republican. I don't see that kind of scenario repeating itself because what's a lot different now relative to 2015? Number one, the Democratic Party in Louisiana continues to have a larger and larger black majority in terms of voter registration. And black voters are no longer content to just let white Democrats be the party's standard bearers. So I would fully expect a black Democratic candidate to try to step up and run for governor. The other thing, which in addition to that reality, as well as the 60% of the Democratic voters being black, you don't really have anybody of statewide stature on the Democratic side who could run. And so that certainly creates a challenge. And the other thing, too, which is kind of lurking in the background but could become a reality, is there's talk about returning Louisiana to party primaries as opposed to the open primary, which is how we run our elections. What that means in plain terms is if you had a party primary, all of a sudden Democrats and Republicans are running in separate swim lanes for the primary, and the Democratic electorate is going to be much more liberal than would be having 100% of Louisianians vote in the same primary, which means I don't think you could have a John Bel Edwards squeeze through in the primary ever again. So you would have a continuous series of Democratic candidates who would be more on the liberal side and would thus be unelectable statewide. So it'll be an interesting scenario in 2023 where there's things that I think you'll be unique to that race that certainly were not around in 2015.
And in terms of just a final question, long term, do you see any path, if you're looking at swings, or I guess I should say trends now in the different parishes in Louisiana, do you see any potential path, whether it be by increasing minority populations or changing affiliations among suburban white voters? Do you see any path to Democrats ever winning statewide in Louisiana over the next few decades?
I never say never, and my attitude about the path forward would be similar to what's happening in Georgia, because like Georgia, Louisiana has a 30% black voter registration, so that immediately gives the Democrats a large voter base. The challenge is, where do you go to get that remaining 20%? And what we've seen in terms of the last two Democrats, which is John Bel Edwards and Mary Landrieu before him, who were able to win statewide, the way they did so was by holding down the Republican margins in the larger suburban parishes. So in other words, you didn't have large Republican victories in Jefferson Parish or St. Tammany, or the Democratic margins were even more top-heavy in East Baton Rouge. Doing well in the larger parishes in South Louisiana would be what a Democrat would have to be able to do to be theoretically competitive statewide. So even though Democrats are continually shrinking in terms of their influence, it's not like they're 100% hopeless case. I think that you can piece together enough suburban whites, particularly if the Republican takes a more populist or Trumpist tack and says things that only appeal to the rural parishes, because the Baton Rouge and New Orleans media markets are much more cosmopolitan, so to speak, in terms of their candidate preference relative to the other parts of the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I agree that you can never really say never in terms of when political realignments or anything of that nature are going to happen. But I thought it was very interesting hearing what you have to say here, and we're approaching the end of tonight's program, but I appreciate, again, having you on tonight.
Sure.
Do you have any final thoughts on any topic we discussed or maybe didn't discuss that you want to share with the viewers?
Well, I think what's fascinating about the 2nd Congressional District runoff is it is a 2021 variation of the same challenge that Republicans had in 2010, and that is, to what degree does a candidate have to be acceptable to the purist in the party's base? And so in the Republicans' case, the Tea Partiers basically wanted someone who is nearly 100% in agreement with all of their agenda. I see the same thing happening with the progressives here in the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana, where you're talking about one candidate who's much more progressive than the others. And, the question is, how many voters is that hardline tack acceptable to? Because one thing that I think makes it hard for Karen Carter Peterson is she's come out in favor of the Green New Deal. Well, in petrochemical heavy Louisiana, that's immediately going to be problematic, because virtually every single one of those parishes between Baton Rouge and New Orleans has petrochemical facilities, and of course voters that go along with it of both races.
Mm-hmm.
So even if those voters are Democratic in most elections, when it comes to a choice of which Democrat they would support, i.e. someone who's more vocally for the Green New Deal as opposed to someone who is not quite that vocal, I think there's going to be some cleavages in how that Democratic vote goes along those kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's especially fascinating. And it's definitely something that you can kind of expand and take in the whole United States, because it's these issues and these dichotomies between racial groups and even just political affiliations, you can find them in any state. And honestly, they kind of drive, like you said, the king-making process, who wins and who loses.
Yes.
Subtle little differences on policy can make a big deal.
And as a final thought, one of the things important too is when we're talking about majority-minority district, the white minority now becomes the voter block worth getting, because since typically in those situations you'll have a minority candidate running against a minority candidate, it's then the white vote that becomes where you're competing over. And that certainly is the case here in the 2nd Congressional District.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for coming on tonight. And we're going to wrap up tonight's show. So thank you, everybody, for watching.